course, at 7,500, they sound pretty nice too. So most people know the story of Mr. Lamborghini and Mr. Ferrari not seeing eye to eye. Mr. Lamborghini buys a Ferrari, says it's a really nice car, but he's got problems with it all the time. Mr. Ferrari, who really is about race cars, not about road cars, says, well, that's how it is, and if you don't like it, go elsewhere. So Mr. Lamborghini decides he will go elsewhere, but he's going to go to a shop which builds tractors. How does a tractor manufacturer think he's going to build a car to compete with Ferrari? Well, Ferrari was all about race cars. Mr. Lamborghini decides he's going to be all about road cars. He doesn't want to race. He doesn't want to get into the war with Ford versus Ferrari where they're spending so much money they're almost on the verge of bankruptcy to win Le Mans or any of the other races. He decides he's going to build the ultimate GT car to start with. Something reliable, something good looking, and something fast. But he is going to give a little dig to Mr. Ferrari. He's going to hire Mr. Bizzarini. Mr. Bizzarini happened to be one of the most important guys when they built the 250 GTO, that car that pretty much made Ferrari what it is. So the first thing Mr. Bizzarini does is he builds this fabulous 12-cylinder engine, 4-cam, making tons of power. It's a work of art. They put it into the 350 GT, doesn't sell that well. So they increase the cubic inch, make a 400 GT, doesn't sell that well. Well, Mr. Lamborghini decides he's going to hire a bunch of young people. Mr. Lamborghini hires Mr. Dallara, Mr. Stanzani, and Bob Wallace, a New Zealander. All of these guys are in their 20s. Mr. Lamborghini says, you guys are young, you guys are energetic. What can you do for my company? So the 3 20-something-year-old engineers and mechanics are working at night to produce this great car. They're not sure what it's even going to be. It starts out with a chassis. Well, Dallara is actually an aircraft engineer, and he takes a lot of his cues from the aircraft industry, the way a lot of racers did back in the day. But he does this sheet metal type monocoque, and it's got perforations all in it to make it light. It's a 150-pound chassis, and he's got this giant 43-inch long engine that's a great engine, but it doesn't fit. So where does he take inspiration from? The Mini. They turn it sideways and they create this really complicated casting that has the engine, the transmission, and basically the rear end all stuffed into one casting, all using the same oil to make this thing work. They put it in sideways, so they get this killer chassis, independent front and rear, super lightweight, but they have no body for it. They say, well, we're going to take it to the Turin Auto Show in 1965 and we'll show it off, and hopefully this state-of-the-art chassis with this motor in it sideways will garner sales for the 400 GT. Well, it does garner sales, but for this car that they don't even know what it's going to look like. They get 10 orders for cars and there's no body yet. But at that same show, Bertoni's saying, hey, this is a cool chassis, let us build the body. And they do. So Bertoni's new designer, Mr. Gandini, who's been there maybe a couple weeks, maybe a month, but he's brand new to Bertoni, says, I can pen this thing. So he pens this beautiful looking car in a couple of days. A couple of days. Bertoni loves the look of it. He puts his little finishing touches on it. It goes from a chassis at the Turin Auto Show in '65 to a prototype at the Geneva Auto Show in '66. 5 months later, the world goes crazy over this brand new car, what most people call the first real supercar. Again, designed to be a supercar, not a super race car. Ferraris were race cars first, then they were road cars. The Ford GT40 was a race car first, then it was a road car. Most of the cool cars in the day really came from racing. So after the Geneva Auto Shows, they've got a book of orders. They've got customers that want cars. They rush it into production, and the car is really the P400. And the first cars, they came with thinner wall chassis. The first 125 cars had 0.8 mil chassis, but they were flexi flyers. They actually weren't that strong and they had to do a bunch of reinforcing. The next bunch of cars had 1 mil steel chassis, again perforated and lightweight, but just a little bit more rigid. There's some subtle differences really between the P400 the S, the SV. The Jota's a little bit of a different animal. There's only maybe 6 of those, and then some of the prototypes, they're a little different. But the real production cars, P400, the P400S, and the SV. And really the differences between a P400 and an S, this one happens to be S, is trim. All of this trim was really blacked out on the first P400s. The 400s had the eyebrows, which was really cool, as did the S's. Now, if you come and look at the front of this, this is something real cool. I'm not sure if it was a mistake or it was designed this way. So a really cool design feature is when both doors were open and you catch the car right from the front, it looks like the horns of a bull. A couple other really cool firsts is obviously it sits super low. They got their inspiration from the GT40. It's almost the same height. If you put the two side by each, they're pretty close. They're both really slick, good looking cars. Again, this one wasn't so much a race car, but it was a 170-mile-an-hour car in 1966. It was the fastest production car of its time. And like I said, it was really the beginning of that supercar era. If you're looking at buying one of these cars or looking at the value of these cars, the SV from the production cars would be the most valuable. It's a split sump. And remember before I told you the engine, the transmission, and the differential all use the same casing and the same oil? Well, later they actually did what they call a split sump in the last SVs, and that's where they separate the oiling for those two components. Makes it a little bit more reliable and a little bit less complicated. Also, the later S's had ventilated rotors, made it a little bit better from a stopping point of view. But most of the cars generally are just about as fast, a little bit lighter, a little bit heavier, a little bit more horsepower. They're all around 170-mile-an-hour cars. They're all around a 6-second 0 to 60-mile-an-hour time, and they're all great looking cars. It's very subtle, the differences. With the engine behind the passenger compartment, the fuel had to get filled up from the front. It's got a nice tank in the front, which actually helps with how the car drives if the tank's full. A little extra weight turns in a little bit better. A little less weight because you're running low on fuel, doesn't turn as nice. Actually gets a little light in the front end, especially at 170 miles an hour. Now this car is a good example to let me show you what you should be looking for to understand how tricky the Miuras were, in the sense of Lamborghini built the chassis and obviously the engines. The bodies were built by Bartoni. They were merged together, so they had a different numbering system for the body, for the chassis, and for the engine. And none of them really coincide with each other, but I'll show you where all those numbers are. So let's start at the front. The actual chassis number is a plate welded on here, and it says Lamborghini P400 Miura, and then the actual number. The later SVs, this was stamped right into this panel here because this was easy to take off and put on another car, which happened with probably almost 20 cars back in the day. For tax reasons, if an original owner got in an accident and the car was really wrecked, they actually took that off, put it on a brand new car, gave him the new car, of course billed him for it, but he didn't have to pay the taxes twice. That happened on quite a few cars in period. The next tag is on this foot box here. And here you'll see it's a P400. Again, you'll see the chassis number, you'll see the motor number here, and you'll see also the body number. So the motor number 30467 is on the motor. Unlike some of the other Ferraris and muscle cars where it's really hard to see the engine number, it's right on top, super simple to find. Here it is, 30467. While we're back here, we'll look at the back clamshell. And just so you know what the body's made of, the main tub, if you want, which is basically a monocoque tub with sheet metal welded together, very rigid, very light, and the roof is steel. Front clamshell, rear clamshell is done in aluminum. And again, the bodies were all numbered. So if you look up here, you can see 572. Not only did they number the clamshell, they numbered every single louver as well. So when you go down here, you can see if it's the original louvers. They also numbered the sills. If you look here, you see the 572 on the front of the rocker panels. If you look in the front here, you also see the 572 on the front of the clamshell. There's numbers all over this thing. Underneath the door handle, on this piece here, there's 572. There's numbers all over the place on this car. So when you have all of the louvers, the front clamshell, the rear clamshell, the rockers, the doors, you know the car's likely not had too much trauma. So one of the other things, when you close the clamshell, you have this handle here. You want to make sure it's open. You want to make sure this closes. And then you want to make sure this pin goes in here, because if you don't get that pin in, you're driving along 170 miles an hour, wouldn't be the first guy that lost a rear clamshell. The cars are really comfortable to sit in, and the layout is really nice. You got the speedometer, you have the tach, the two big gauges in front of you. Then you have all the engine gauges off to the right, and then you got these cool toggle switches on this upper console. Very much aircraft inspired again. Lara, being an aircraft engineer, certainly had a part in this. The color combinations is the other thing that was just, you know, crazy. They had the coolest colors on the exterior. You know, they had reds and oranges and greens and blues and some funky colors over the years, but the interior colors were just as cool, this being one of them. Who would put a red exterior with a blue interior? Well, only 12 S's were built with the Rosso Corsa outside and the blue interior. I think the combination looks wild. I've seen green on blues and, you know, yellows with greens, and it's just, there's some crazy color combinations on these cars. And it was, let's face it, you know, the psychedelic 60s, early 70s, colors were in. Now everybody agrees the body is just spectacular. It's beautiful. There isn't a line that's wrong on it. The interior is great, but the real pleasure in this car is how it drives. Now this car was just restored in Germany, and it's a beautiful cosmetic restoration. And I'll give the Europeans one thing, is they really like their cars to work. It's not just about the show. They really make sure that mechanically the cars are just perfect. All the gauges work on it, the car shifts nice, the car drives down the road really well. It's a real pleasure to drive a car after it's been restored that works as good as it looks. And of course, at 7,500, they sound pretty nice too. So let's talk about values. So the P400s, they built 275. Call them they're the bottom of the totem pole, but fabulous cars and really not that much different. They're anywhere from 1.5 for a good driver. They just sold a really great killer restored car for 2.2, 2.3. For the S's, they built 338, actually the highest production number, but a little bit better car, a little bit more horsepower, a little bit more refined. The bigger brakes on the later cars. Values on the S's go up a little bit from there. So again, you know, a good driver would be in the high ones. A concours perfect car would be in the mid twos. And then you get into the SVs, and those cars, 150 are built. They're the rarest of the bunch. They're the most sophisticated. Again, a little bit more horsepower. The back end is very different. It's a lot wider. It's got, you know, better suspension. It's a better handling car. The body's a little different. It's just a more muscular, tougher looking car, and probably the fastest, best handling of the bunch. Values go up to 3.5, maybe a snip more for a perfect car. And then you have the prototypes and the Jodas and the Roadster. You know, you're talking about a handful of cars, you know, 6 Jodas and 5 prototypes and a couple of here and there that were rebuilt cars or special cars built one off. And they can go 5 million and up, depending on how great the car is and what the history is, and when the buyer and seller get together on those cars, because they don't trade too often. So the story of the Miura is a really cool story. You got a bunch of young guys in their 20s that build this car. It is the world's first supercar. It's the first car to go 170 miles an hour production car. It's the car that really began that era. And then for their next trick, they build the Countach, but that's a whole different story again.